Butcher's Crossing by John Williams, a novel that goes to show that Westerns can indeed have literary value. Because, as I mentioned in a previous video, the Western genre is not really saturated, I guess, with novels which can be held aloft as grand achievements of human literature. But Butcher's Crossing goes to show that exceptions do exist. And this book was a humdinger of a book. So, John Williams was not the most popular author in his lifetime. However, he has seen a great surge in popularity in recent years with the reprinting of most of his books by, or all of his books, I suppose, by the New York Review of Books publishing line. He only wrote 4 books in his lifetime: Nothing But the Night, Butcher's Crossing, Stoner, that's the one that he's known for mainly today, and Augustus, which actually won the National Book Award. It's ironic then that despite winning that highly prestigious award, his books were out of print for, or most of his books at least, were out of print for years until fairly recently. So he was not the most popular author in his lifetime, but now he enjoys a pretty high level of renown, and I think it is well earned. I reviewed earlier in the year, some months ago, I reviewed Stoner, the book that seems to have just exploded in popularity recently, and I really love that book. I think that is a rare, exceedingly rare example of a truly perfect book. I don't think I would have changed one word in that book. It was excellent start to finish. It did what it set out to do clearly, succinctly, and with great eloquence. And it is a rare, again, exceedingly rare occasion when I can say that a book is truly perfect. But I think Stoner was. However, Butcher's Crossing, while not as perfect as Stoner, which I'll get to, I think this may just be John Williams's finest novel. And I say that not having read Augustus, which is the one that won the National Book Award, so maybe that's a little presumptuous of me to say that. And I haven't read Nothing But the Night, which was his first novel, but considering that he himself disowned that novel entirely, I think we can exclude that one from the running. But even though Butcher's Crossing was not a perfect novel, I think it may just be his best, and I think it probably is my favorite of his. So let's talk about Butcher's Crossing. What is Butcher's Crossing about? Well, Butcher's Crossing, as I said, is a Western novel, and it is a pretty earnest Western, I suppose. It doesn't, as I reviewed, the last Western novel that I reviewed was Oakley Hall's Warlock, a novel that on the surface is a classic white hat, black hat kind of Western, but underneath the surface deftly subverts your expectations and deconstructs the mythology of the West. This book doesn't really do that. It's very earnest in its in the conveyance of its story. It doesn't really try to subvert anything, or I don't think it does. Rather, it just tries to tell a relatively simple, although highly impactful story, and it tells it mostly very well. So, Butcher's Crossing is the story of Will Andrews, a tenderfoot Easterner who comes west to the small town of Butcher's Crossing because he wants to find himself. And in particular, he wants to explore himself in relation to nature after becoming introduced to the philosophy of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a well-remembered American philosopher from the 1800s who was, I guess, the leading figure of the Transcendentalist movement. And so young Will Andrews doesn't really know who he is because he has lived a relatively insular and sheltered kind of life in, I think it was Boston. And so he wants to go west to find adventure and see who he really is underneath. So he comes to Butcher's Crossing, which is a small town that survives on the buffalo market, the market for buffalo hides. And he meets up with and by the way, I'm going to spoil this book, spoilers right now, because I have to really elaborate on why this book is so good, so I'm going to spoil it. So he just be warned. So he meets up with a buffalo hunter named Miller and his alcoholic uh, sidekick, one-handed sidekick named Charlie Hogue, and they set off for the Colorado wilderness with a skinner named Fred Schneider, and they go off to hunt buffalo. And when they get to the mountains where they find this scenic little vale that is cut off from the outside of the world but contains thousands of buffalo, they proceed to slaughter a lot of buffalo. And they get so wrapped up in their mindless killing that they get snowed in the mountains and they have to spend the winter there. And basically, they have to go through some crap. And he gets toughened up, by all the adversity he's having to face, Will Andrews. And they eventually return to Butcher's Crossing with nothing to show for their efforts due to great misfortune. And they discover, wouldn't you know it, that the market for buffalo hides has completely collapsed and all their work was for nothing and life sucks, in other words. So that's the plot of Butcher's Crossing. It's a fairly short novel. My edition was only 274 pages, not a long book, but it packs a lot in there. It really does. And I think this is, as I said earlier, I think this is my favorite of John Williams's novels. Of course, I've only read 2 out of his 4. And I will say that I think this is probably his best, even though it is perhaps his least perfect. And I'll get to that. So, uh, Stoner was a perfect book, I think. I really do think that was a perfect book. I wouldn't have changed a letter of it. I wouldn't have changed one word. I think it was perfect as it was. However, Stoner was an oddity. It is a book that is considered to be a work of literature, literature, um, a work that has literary merit, even though it's not really about anything per se. I mean, it's more of just a character study, a very quiet, often melancholic character study about a professor, but there's no real theme that drives the novel. It doesn't really engage with any ideas or try to explore any topics or philosophical notions or anything like that. It's just a simple, immaculately told story, and it's perfect in that. It really is. However, Butcher's Crossing has a little bit more under the hood, I think, and that's why I think, to me at least, it was edged out Stoner, even though it's definitely not nearly as perfect as that book. This book is a work that really kind of, without being too upfront about it, it kind of attacks the um, ideology, I think, of uh, Ralph Waldo Emerson's transcendentalism. That is to say that nature is divine and that we need to connect with nature in order to discover who we really are inside and learn about ourselves. This book doesn't really think that that's the best idea, or at least I don't think it did. That's my takeaway, because nature is pretty cruel and pretty impartial and heartless, as these characters learn. And so this book actually kind of is driven by an idea, that is the uh, a kind of veiled attack on transcendentalism. And it's about a young, again, we've seen, I guess, the trope of the tenderfoot Easterner in Western fiction, whether it be novels or movies, umpteen times by now. But this one does it in a more artful way, I think, because it really uses that trope to get at something that, uh, to quote, I guess, Planet of the Apes, don't look for it, Taylor. You may not like what you find. Because while Will Andrews definitely does discover some deeper truths about himself and perhaps some deeper truths about humanity in general, they're not the most pleasant, it would seem. So, uh, as prior to leaving for the mountains of Colorado to go hunt the buffalo, Will Andrews has an encounter, a rather kind of inept and slightly comical and kind of cringy encounter with a prostitute in the town of Butcher's Crossing named Francine. And she remarks how different he is from the other men. in the town because he is not coarse, he is not rough, he is soft, both literally and figuratively. And she likes that about him because he's a tad more refined and he's more ponderous and earnest and a bit more heartfelt than the other men, the buffalo hunters whom she usually services. And she likes that about him, and she's drawn to him because of that. But it's the very things that she points out in him and which attracts her to him that Will Andrews is trying to lose. He's trying to lose his softness. He's trying to be hardened up through head-on challenge with nature. He's trying to be kind of what the other people are. And the book does a great job of showing how naive that can really be because uh, it should not be thought that the other way of being, the coarse, callous, rough, kind of vulgar way that the other men, the rough and tumble uh, buffalo hunters live, it should not be thought that that is necessarily the superior mode of existence to what he is now. That is to say that Will Andrews comes from a very civilized world and he is trying to lose some measure of that civility in himself and trying to reconnect with a more wild and untamed part of himself by immersing himself in the wild, in nature. And the book kind of does a great job of just cutting that outlook down to size and showing that civilization is better than the wilderness. The civilization is better, that civility is better than wildness. As this book does a great job of hammering home, because nature sucks. They spend the whole winter starving to death almost in the snow, and all their work is ultimately for nothing. And it's just one calamity after another. And so when he ultimately kind of does discover what he set out to discover, it's not nearly as illustrious and um, alluring as he thought it would be. And so it kind of begs the question, you probably didn't need to do any of this anyway. And so I think that's the main driving gist of this book. But there's also some other commentary towards the end, definitely, about the precarious nature of free market enterprise. Because when you're dealing in a commodity such as buffalo hides, as these men are, I mean, the entire legitimacy of your enterprise is based upon the value of this one commodity, and if the market falls out, you're screwed. And these men are at the end. They nearly die. One of them actually does die. They go through so much heck trying to get these buffalo hides, and then when they get back, it's like, oh, we didn't. The market's done. They're worthless now, and it really is just kind of this almost cosmic cruelty of just how futile this entire endeavor, this entire story was. But that's the point of it. That's the point of it. I mean, it's kind of about the fragility of a dream, I think, and in particular the fragility of the American dream, because the American dream is something that was kind of intrinsically tied to westward expansion. Manifest destiny. We are going to conquer this land. Every one of us is capable of rising to whatever levels they aspire to. And the buffalo hunters are trying to make serious bank by slaughtering hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of buffalo, but every bubble will eventually pop. And so this book does a great job of ramming home the reality of how things actually are. That actually your profit, your ability to go up is dependent upon forces which you cannot control, and they don't. Those forces do not care about you. Those forces are entirely impartial to you and apathetic to your plight. And life is cruel sometimes, and this book paints that picture wonderfully. And in terms of the characters, this book is pretty good, maybe not great. It is a very limited third person point of view. Everything is told from Will Andrews' perspective, so consequently, he is the only character whose internal landscape we become familiar with. The major other character besides Will is Miller, the Buffalo Hunter guy, and he's probably the most memorable character out of this. Although you may not really like him, because I definitely did not like him. Um, when they get to the mountains, then you really kind of see what kind of man Miller actually is, because Will is kind of, he's out of his element, he's out of his depth. He's not familiar with any of this. He's never killed any kind of game, he's never skinned anything, and so he's just kind of enamored of Miller the buffalo hunter, and he's at his mercy. But when they get to the mountains, Miller proves that he's quite possibly kind of borderline insane, because the when they get to killing these buffalo, they kill buffalo a lot, and it's really kind of painful to read. Not that I'm against hunting game. I mean, hell, I live in Arkansas. That's a big sport, hunting. I've done it. I've killed living isms, but this kind of just no quarter slaughter bloodbath is really painful to read about, especially when you know historically now what that did to the buffalo, that it just decimated their population, and subsequently I think had a great effect on the Native Americans population, because that was their main food source, which they took only as much as they needed, whereas the Europeans just killed them by the hundreds of thousands and just utterly destroyed their populations. And that's what these men do. And they kill nearly every buffalo, of which it says there are several thousand in this valley which they come to. They kill nearly every buffalo, and all they take is the hide, the skin. I mean, that's all they take. And so it's just this wanton destruction and waste. And it's made so much more brutal at the end, when it's revealed that none of it even mattered, and it was all for naught to begin with. It's a hard message, but I don't want this book to seem like it has some kind of environmentalist message. I mean, I think there is a bit of that about the you can only take so much before a resource is just exhausted, as the buffalo were in real life. But I don't really think it is preoccupied too much with that, because the way that it portrays the slaughter of the buffalo is very mechanistic. It's not romanticized or made up as some kind of horrendous act of cruelty, which I guess it kind of is, depending on your perspective. It's not made out to be like this brutal, just depraved act. Rather, it's just business. It's what people do. But it does. There is, a kernel of that kind of tone to it, knowing now what we know about what happened to the buffalo populations in the Old West, how they were just completely destroyed. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the plains buffalo was actually hunted to extinction, and that the buffalo that exist on the plains now are actually the mountain. There was actually two subspecies: the plains buffalo and the mountain buffalo. And the plains buffalo, I believe, don't quote me on this because I'm not an ecologist or biologist, but I believe the plains buffalo actually was hunted to extinction, and that the buffalo that occupy some of the plains today are actually reintroduced or introduced specimens of the mountain variety of buffalo, which looks slightly different, if you know what you're looking for, than the plains buffalo. I guess I don't know, something about their anatomy looks different. But I think they actually did kill every last plains buffalo, and they did it like they did in this book. They killed them by the thousands, and they just took their hides and just left the meat and everything for the vultures. And it really is kind of painful to read. Just if you're not if you're prone to kind of frustration due to waste and just needless violence, it is kind of painful to read. But the real meat of this book, pun intended, is the character transformation of Will Andrews from a civilized and rather constrained or moral, I don't want to say immoral, but kind of, subdued Easterner who has never seen anything like this, to someone who can do this kind of thing and kind of embraces it because that's what you have to do at that point to survive, to make a living, or even as they get snowed in the mountains, just to live themselves. Uh, but yeah, this book covers a lot, and the ending to this book is fantastic. Uh, I I kind of waffled on how I was going to rate this book throughout the majority of it, but then that ending is divided into three parts. The second part is the longest, which covers the majority of the story, the slaughter of the buffalo and whatnot. But the brief third part was amazing. Like that, the way it wrapped it up, and the way that Will looks back on the ordeal that he's just undertaken and what he's come to learn about himself and about the nature of life. That was amazing. That was really good, and so that's why I think this edges out Stoner, for me at least, as John Williams' best book. But again, I say that having not read his other two books. But it is not as perfect as Stoner, and the major flaw to me with this is the writing. John Williams was a phenomenal writer, as evinced by Stoner, because that book is impeccably crafted on a prose level. Butcher's Crossing, not so much. There are some truly striking passages in this, and again, more towards the end. That third part is some incredible writing, but the writing was not as strong as in Stoner. And it must be remembered that this was his second book, whereas Stoner, I believe, was his third. So I believe there was a lot of improvement between books 2 and 3. But this book, the writing, it was, there were parts of it that were just breathtaking, but some of the sentences were worded in a rather unwieldy manner. I think some things could have been worded better, and I swear I have never seen so many semicolons in a book as I have in Butcher Crossing. This was an ejaculation of semicolons. And I'm not saying that I'm against semicolons or that that's an objective flaw with the book, but it did not strike my fancy when every sentence almost has 2 to 3 or maybe even more semicolons. Like, count the number of semicolons that he uses in this book, and it is astounding. And I don't think every sentence needs to have 2 or 3 semicolons in it. I think you should probably just, if you're having to use that many, maybe think about rewording your sentences or breaking them up a little bit more. And again, I'm not saying that that's objectively bad, but I did not think it was nearly as um, eloquent as Stoner was, because Stoner was, again, that the writing in that book was just perfect. This one, not so much. So there is a weakness in the writing, I think, in this. Not major, because I think this is still better written than loads of other books out there, probably the majority of other books out there. So I think this is still written really good, but just not as strong as his other book. But the fact that this book was about something more than what I guess Stoner was about, uh, it edges it out, I think. And plus, I guess I would rather just read about some cowboys killing buffalo than I would about a dry, dead inside academic who fails miserably at life. And no, I love that book. The Stoner was such a great book. I love it, but there is a little bit more of interest, I guess, in this book, or at least for me. And if that makes me a Philistine because I'd rather read about, cowboys decimating, decimating a population of buffalo rather than, a professor who fails at everything and then dies. I mean, I guess if the shoe fits, but to rate Butcher's Crossing, I'd probably give this a B plus or maybe even an A minus. It's probably maybe an A minus or teetering on the edge between B plus and A minus, because the writing could have been a little bit tighter, I think. But on the whole, this book was fantastic, and you would do well to read it. So yeah, Butcher's Crossing by John Williams. Have you read Butcher's Crossing? If you have, let me know down in the comments what you thought about it, whether you have agreed or disagreed with anything I've said here today. And if you haven't read Butcher's Crossing, definitely give a thought to checking it out. because I believe it is a not only a fantastic western, I think probably one of the best westerns out there, but I think it's also just a fantastic book as well. And if you like Stoner or any of John Williams's other books, you owe it to yourself to read this. So yeah, definitely do give a look. And as always, if you have enjoyed anything you've seen or heard here today, remember to like, subscribe, help the channel out a little bit. I would greatly appreciate it. And until next time, peace.